Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Henderson, the Associate Director for Education and Exhibitions at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm very pleased to introduce today's program and speaker. February 2nd, 2022 marks the 100th anniversary of the publication of James Joyce's novel Ulysses. This landmark work of literary modernism owes a considerable debt to the silent behind-the-scenes labor of three gay American women, Margaret Anderson, Jane Heap, and Sylvia Beach, as well as that of British publisher Harriet Shaw Weaver. Their work on Joyce's behalf is the subject of an upcoming Ransom Center exhibition titled Women in the Making of Joyce's Ulysses, opening at the center in early March. The exhibition has been organized for the center by today's speaker, Dr. Clare Hutton, who is Reader in English and Digital Humanities at Loughborough University in the UK. Her monograph, Serial Encounters, Ulysses and the Little Review, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, has just been reissued in paperback. Her other works include The Irish Book in English, 1891 to 2000, and many essays on William Butler Yeats, James Joyce, and the Irish literary revival. In this curator's introduction to the exhibition, Dr. Hutton will introduce some of the key ideas, objects, and people featured in Women and the Making of Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses. What did Anderson, Heap, Beach, and Weaver do to facilitate the making of Joyce's work? What role did family members play in enabling Joyce's creativity? What do we know of Joyce's mother, his partner Nora, and other female family members? And how did they help, and how are they represented within Joyce's densely autobiographical text? In order to answer these questions, Dr. Hutton's talk will focus in particular on two very different women, Sylvia Beach, Paris bookshop owner turned publisher, and Joyce's mother, May Joyce. Claire, we're delighted to have you join us today, and thank you so much for all the work you have put into creating this marvelous exhibition.
Thank you for inviting me to curate the exhibition. It's been an absolute joy to work on this, and in particular to work with Kathy, who's believed in the idea of the work from the outset and has worked so hard to make it possible. I'd also like to thank the Irish Consulate in Austin for supporting this work. I begin my slideshow with this lovely image of the Ransom Center at night and a lone cyclist outside, and also with the exhibition concept identity, which shows Sylvia Beach, about whom I'm going to talk, standing in the doorway of her bookshop in Paris, Shakespeare and Company, at around the time when she committed to the publication of Ulysses. And what I'd like to talk about first of all is the question of what we're actually celebrating on the 2nd of February 2022. And here's a nice vitrine showing a first edition of Ulysses. And of course, what we're celebrating is the achievement of Ulysses itself. And a book with so much appeal for so many different kinds of reader. Books can cross national borders, but some books do so more easily than others. Though Ulysses is relentlessly specific about Dublin, and One Day in Dublin, 16th of June 1904, is very successful in appealing across international boundaries, and it rewrites the norms of realism and how to represent character and thought. On the 2nd of February 1922, Sylvia Beach got up, went to the train station to collect 2 copies of Ulysses, which had been sent on the overnight train from Dijon by Maurice Durantier, the printer. She went straight to Joyce's apartment and gave him 1 copy, and then she put the other on display in the window of Shakespeare and Company. In the days that followed, she began the process of fulfilling orders for the 1,000 copies of the work she'd commissioned from Durantier. The day was Joyce's 40th birthday, and he had worked very hard, very intensely on completing the novel, on revising, adding, expanding, somewhat compulsively. The process of proofing had actually begun in June 1921. Proofing, normally thought to take maybe 3 or 4 weeks for even a complicated book, had actually taken 6 months. even 7 months, right into the end of January. Joyce was revising to the very last minute, searching for the mot juste, the exact words in the exact order. And in a sense, it's lucky that the occasion of his 40th birthday came along. The combined forces of his ego, of his exhaustion, and the expectation of others, which finally forced him to finish Ulysses. Interestingly, Beach had actually thought that Ulysses would be a work of 600 pages to be published in October 1921. She actually ended up publishing a work of 732 pages in February 1922. So it gives you a sense of quite how much the work had expanded. Well, exhibitions are an opportunity to explore new ways of thinking. And in no sense is this exhibition a last word or a definitive argument. Instead, it's intended as a possibility of exploration. And it really centers on one very easy question, which is, what role did women play in enabling the creation of Ulysses? It's a huge book. We can see this from the image. 240,000 words, 240,000 words. Books are inherently social, and Joyce might have liked to cultivate the image of the lone genius in the Paris attic, struggling with material circumstance, but actually the archives, the manuscripts, the publishing history of this work tells a very different story. And in particular, I want to draw attention to 4 women associated with the book trades who do much to make Ulysses happen. Harriet Shaw Weaver, Jane Heap, Margaret Anderson, and Sylvia Beach. So working through these women in the order in which Joyce met them, the first woman I want to talk about is Harriet Shaw Weaver. And here she is in a photograph from the British Library. This photo was taken in October 1916, just after she'd turned 40. And she sent it by post to Joyce, which is interesting in and of itself. Harriet Shaw Weaver was introduced to Joyce in 1914 through the auspices of Ezra Pound, who was working behind the scenes at the journal that Weaver edited, The Egoist. And it was Pound who suggested that The Egoist should serialize portrait of the artist as a young man. A serialization which began again on Joyce's birthday, but this time the 2nd of February 1914. And actually they published portrait in tiny sections, so it took a very long time to get the work through press. And over the course of 1914, Weaver was gradually getting a sense of Joyce. The correspondence began in November 1914, by which time Joyce was facing the upheavals of war. He eventually moved from Trieste to Zurich in June 1915. And when he did so, he had just begun Ulysses. He had 2 early versions of 2 chapters in hand. Once Joyce was in Zurich, he found that his source of income was considerably constrained, partly because of the war, and he was no longer able to teach English. Weaver began to become aware of his financial need, and she began to support him financially from 1916, initially small sums for things like serial rights or for publishing of various kinds. And then from May 1917, she started to give him something that equated to more like an income, £50 per quarter. And then from May 1919, she gave him a gift of £5,000, which was invested and would give him 5% of £5,000 per annum. Again, it was a form of income. So Weaver, I think, is really one of the most interesting and one of the most important women behind Ulysses. The financial support really does enable the composition of the work and Joyce's complete concentration on Ulysses. 2 other women who are really important here, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. This is Margaret Anderson, a studio portrait photograph, which will be on display in the exhibition. This was taken by Berenice Abbott in 1928. Margaret Anderson was editor of an avant-garde literary periodical in New York called The Little Review. And Ezra Pound was the foreign editor of The Little Review from May 1917. And it was Pound who advocated that the Little Review should serialize Ulysses in a process that began in March 1918. There's no doubt that the serialization really helped Joyce because it's not exactly the case that he was writing to deadlines, but he was aware that he was writing for an audience, that his work was finding an audience, and he began to finish, individual chapters in sequence during 1918. It was an extremely important year for the book. So by the time he finished 1918, he'd actually finished the first 9 chapters of the work. Serialization of Ulysses was controversial really from the outset. The Little Review was already really in trouble with the US Post Office and had been written down in a register of publications of anarchistic tendency, even before they began to publish Ulysses. And that's actually because of their open support of Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap for Emma Goldman, noted and well-known anarchist of the period. And so the officials at the post office who were charged with seeking out, in the context of the war, publications of which were deemed to be problematic, partly because of their anarchism, they were drawn to the Little Review, and they began to look quite carefully at what was being published in its pages. Eventually, things came to a head with the issue of July-August 1920, when the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice took legal action against the editors of the Little Review. And the trial, which ensued in February 1921, really turns on questions of close reading of chapter 13 of Ulysses, the third installment of chapter 13 of Ulysses. And the question really is, what is Bloom actually doing on Sandymount Strand? And what is Gertie McDowell up to? How knowing is she? Can there be any doubt? Well, the judgment went against the Little Review editors, and the text was deemed to be obscene, to corrupt and deprave the morals of any reader, and the Little Review editors were deemed guilty. It wasn't Joyce who was guilty of writing an obscene text, it was the Little Review editors who were guilty of publishing an obscene text. The judgment, the news of the judgment against the Little Review reached Joyce in Paris in April 1921, and Joyce immediately persuaded Beach to publish Ulysses. And one might say, well, the rest is history. Beach takes up the cause of Ulysses and publishes the text as we know it in February 1922. It is significant that women do so much to put Ulysses into the world, and it is, I think, an under-acknowledged history. Of course, it's also true that men played a role in this process, John Quinn especially, who helped to finance the publication of the Little Review by paying Ezra Pound a stipend for his work as editor. But I think it's also the case that there would be no Ulysses if the women hadn't helped out quite so significantly. And in particular, I would draw attention to the material support given by Harriet Shaw Weaver. What the history reveals is some interesting facts, that 3 of the women who did so much for Ulysses were American and were openly gay. That's, I think, a very important component in this history, but what exactly is the significance? Well, certainly, I think this is something we should openly note and remember. And it's also, of course, important to realize that gay women were more likely to be in the workplace because they weren't, in the domestic sphere having children. It's interesting, though, that Joyce appears not to notice that the women were gay. There's very little in the correspondence about any kind of correlation between sexual preference and the political significance of that identity, or a correlation between their sexual identity and the sexual politics of the work. Clearly, Anderson, Heap, and Beach have an interest in free speech. They are openly candid and libertarian in respect of Ulysses. But there are some important and interesting gaps in the evidence. One of those gaps, I think, relates to their detailed response to the text. There's very little kind of detailed readerly engagement on the part of these various editors and women in the book trades. And that, I think, is something that needs to be explored in a bit more detail. So I've shown a photograph here of Margaret Anderson. I'll move on now and show you this. This is a photograph of Jane Heap, who is Anderson's lover. And I think Heap actually is the person who really is extremely engaged by Ulysses and does all of the practical work in terms of getting the typescripts into print at the Little Review. This is a photograph of Sylvia Beach in her bookshop. I think this photo was taken in 1919. It's before she moved onto the Rue de l'Odéon. She had a shop around the corner from the Rue de l'Odéon, where she first set up business in November 1919. And she herself in the memoir writes about, Virginia Woolf, a room of one's own, and she draws sort of a kind of analogy between her own position and Woolf's position. She calls this a bookshop of one's own. It's very significant that she has this, that she runs her own business. And for a woman of her class and at this time, that's quite an unusual achievement. And it's also worth noting that Beach's partner, Adrien Monnier, also ran a bookshop on the same street in the Rue de l'Odéon from 1921. They were opposite neighbours. Monnier's bookshop, La Maison des Amis des Livres, was there, and Monnier helped Beach in very important and practical ways with the business of getting Ulysses into print, and then of course commissioned the first French translation. So Monnier is another important figure in this history. So the exhibition aims to narrate this history through the objects, through the letters, through editions, first editions, manuscripts and photos. But it's clearly the case that the professional women were not the only women behind Joyce. And in particular, I want to think a little about Joyce's family, Joyce's mother, his Aunt Josephine, and Nora Barnacle. And there is a section about Joyce's family in the exhibition. And of course, it's interesting that these women, the women in Joyce's personal circle, are also glimpsed in the text, and therefore they become quite an interesting part of the narrative. So what I'd like to do now is to move on and talk about two objects in particular. One of them is this very rarely seen letter from Joyce's mother. So this is dated, it's quite tricky to read. It's an 8-page letter, and the slide is just showing us 2 of the pages, just to give viewers a sense of the tone. I'll read a little bit of it. So this was written to Joyce when he had gone to Paris to study medicine, and it was his first year away from home. He had just turned 21. My dearest Jim, your pappy has given me the enclosed to send to you, £1 12s, which will make you safe with your landlady until the end of this month. He was very pleased you wrote to him, and I hope you will do so frequently. Do not mind me, I will hear all the news about you and will understand. Your pappy has been in a curious state of mind for some time past and will not trust me with any money whatever. He's not so bad for the last few days, so I hope it may pass away. And so on. It's just a fascinating letter. It's vivid, it's very lengthy. It gives a very deep sense of the connection and trust that existed between Joyce and his mother, and quite a deep sense of Joyce's family structure more generally. In all, and Joyce was the eldest of 10 surviving children born between 1881 and 1893. And actually in, pages 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the letter, what May Joyce does is work her way through each of the children, talking about what's going on with each child. And it's, it's very, very maternal in that sense. Other reasons why the letter stands out. It gives a very vivid sense of how Joyce's mother held the family together, of the high regard she had for her eldest son. And it's very notably focused on practical issues, things like including the cash to pay the landlady, advice on how to get started in journalism. And right at the end of the letter, there's this crazy undertaking to get a suit cleaned. Joyce is in Paris in 1903 and has a suit which he has observed needs to be cleaned. And Mrs. Joyce's attitude to that is, well, put it in the post, send it home, I'll get it done, and then I'll send it back. It's pretty extreme sort of Irish mother behavior. Even in 2022, that would be quite an undertaking to send something back to get cleaned. And, obviously could you not just get that organized yourself, son? The style, I think, is extremely endearing. She writes with very little punctuation and describes herself as simply talking just as we would do at the fire here. And I think the letter just must have been quite a solace to receive. There's some other things in it that are just fascinating. There's a very clear underlined line in it where she says, you cannot get on in your line without friends. And it's underlined, as I said. And it seems to foretell some of the kind of bitter arguments which characterise Joyce's authorial career. The tragic thing, of course, is that May Joyce didn't live to see those arguments unfold, nor did she see her son's success and worldwide renown. 5 weeks after the letter was written, Joyce received an urgent telegram from his father calling him home. And apparently it read, "Mother dying, come home, father." I'm not entirely sure that telegram really ever existed, but that's what is written into the text of Ulysses, if we believe the testimony of Ulysses as autobiography. So May Joyce died just 4 months after the letter, surrounded by family members. Joyce was 21 and was bitter and angry about the circumstances of her death. He told Nora about his mother, writing about his mother, he said, "When I looked on her face as she lay in the coffin, a face grey and wasted with cancer, I understood that I was looking on the face of a victim, and I cursed the system which had made her a victim." 10 children, as we know, survived, but the birth history is far more extreme. Between 1880 and 1897, there were at least 6 other pregnancies which ended in either infant death, stillbirth, or miscarriage. That actually equates to about 1 pregnancy a year. And Joyce must have been aware of this as the eldest child, and Ulysses is notably sensitive to patterns of birth. Bloom thinks a good deal about his emotional life and what his marriage might have been like if little Rudy had lived. Joyce's mother, like Stephen's in Ulysses, might be seen as a poor soul gone to heaven, who had saved him from being trampled underfoot, but it cannot be said that she died scarcely having been. As the letter shows, May Joyce was a vivid presence in the life of her eldest son and was for a time the centre of his emotional world. And I think her unstinting belief in him was formative for his creative self-confidence. And her premature death hardened his determination to succeed and served him with a depth of emotional experience which he could immediately draw on in his writing. What's particularly remarkable about this letter is the fact that it survives at all, because Joyce did not ordinarily keep personal correspondence, particularly in later life. Somehow he kept hold of this letter through the course of moves from Paris to Dublin to Trieste and so on. So he received it in Paris in 1903, then packed up, left Paris in a hurry on receiving that telegram about the fact that his mother is, dying. He has to go home, hangs on to the letter through those turbulent months, when the 4 months that follow, when she is actually, bedridden and on, her deathbed, as it were. He holds on to the letter. He must keep it, takes it back with him when he goes to Trieste with Nora. It must be in an envelope, and it's just kept. And eventually Stanislaus sells it. Stanislaus's widow sells it to Cornell in the 50s. So it's a tiny fragment of a rich and complicated life, and it points to the significance of Joyce's mother's it points to Joyce's mother's significance in his formation, and to the fundamental correlation between Joyce's life and the life depicted in Ulysses. So it is another way, in a sense, of thinking about women and the making of Ulysses. To move on, I'm just going to look at one more thing, just to really give a sense to listeners of the exhibition to come. This is Sylvia Beach's subscribers list for Ulysses. And it's obviously handwritten by Beach in the period when she was collecting subscriptions for the first edition of Ulysses. And it serves as a sort of potent reminder of the necessary administrative labor and organization going on behind the scenes at Shakespeare and Company. Interestingly, the 1,000 copies of Ulysses had been sold out by June 15th, 1922. That's quite significant and quick turnaround for such an expensive book. Just 4 months to sell those 1,000 copies. And in no small part, that success has to be attributed to Beach's considerable energy, efficiency, and business acumen. Subscribers to the first edition of Ulysses were not required to pay until publication. This page actually records some of those who opted to pay in advance, and includes a few interesting names. In fact, this is a 26-page list, and what you can see on the slide is just one page from that list. Including some interesting names. Alec Waugh here at the top, that's the brother of the novelist and a novelist in his own right. Harriet Weaver, Dora Marsden, editors of The Egoist. W.B. Yeats, who of course is cited and mocked several times in the pages of Ulysses. And then also down near the end, Joseph Hone. I'm trying to see where Joseph Hone is. He's definitely on that list. Yes, he's here. Subscribed for a copy in January 1922. So he was his name was actually Joseph Mansell Hone. He was the former director of Mansell and Company, the Dublin publishing firm, which had refused to publish Dubliners in 1912. It must have been kind of strangely gratifying for Joyce to see such names coming in. So writing to her sister Holly, Beach represents the moment when she decides to publish Ulysses as one of instant success. Ulysses, she says, is going to make my place famous. Already the publicity is beginning and swarms of people visit the shop on hearing the news. But the success of Ulysses was not guaranteed. Actually, subscriptions didn't really come in that quickly. The reluctance to commit to publishing sight unseen can undoubtedly be attributed to price. Signed copies on Dutch paper were 350 francs. That's about $30 at the time, or £7.07 sterling. Large format copies on French handmade paper, 250 francs, $22 or £5.05. And then ordinary copies, that's the cheapest, were 150 francs, $14 or £3.03. So as a point of comparison, a portrait of the artist as a young man was being sold at the time for $2 or 7 and 6. So those were standard book prices for a hardback novel. So $2 or 7 and 6. So you can do some multiplication there to kind of work out quite how expensive even an ordinary copy of Ulysses actually was. Books, even a standard price book, was considered fairly expensive, and many people didn't buy books. Even, you know, quite well-paid middle-class people considered books to be a luxury. That's why lending libraries existed, such as the one run by Sylvia Beach, Shakespeare and Company, and indeed La Maison des Amis des Livres. So really 150 francs was a huge investment, equivalent today to perhaps £250, around that, you know, a lot, a really considerable sum of money to invest in a book sight unseen. So Beach in the end took a considerable risk in deciding to commit to Ulysses and in allowing the considerable extra expense generated by Joyce's extensive rewriting at the proofing stage. And the process didn't make her any great fortune, because she gave Joyce a royalty of 66%, which is unheard of in the business, 66% on the net profits. Certainly the publication of Ulysses did make her bookshop famous, as she'd predicted, but it did so because she worked so tirelessly on Joyce's behalf. So in conclusion, really what I want to say is that Ulysses really couldn't have come into being had it not been for the tireless support of women who did so much to give Joyce material support and to instill a kind of, you know, to keep on communicating confidence, the confidence they had in his ability, the sort of psychological and emotional confidence that he got. First of all, we could see from his mother, but also then from Nora Barnacle, and also people like Aunt Josephine. So on the personal side, you can always see women facilitating that confidence and continuing to kind of feed into it. And on the professional side, we can see that Harriet Shaw Weaver gave very significant financial support to enable the writing of Ulysses, that Anderson and Heap had done so much for the serialization, and then Beach had done so much to publish the book in volume form. So it's an extremely deep and important history of support, which is fundamental to the making of Ulysses.